My name's Amy Barrett Daffin. I'm the publisher at CNT Publishing, and today I'm here with Sarah Trail of the Social Justice Sewing Academy. Hi, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks, Amy. How's it going?
Good, good. Excellent. Well, I'm super excited to talk to you and have you tell me where you got the idea for the Social Justice Sewing Academy, what some of your different projects and programs are, and how long you've been doing it. Just super curious to learn about it. And I know you got a big project in the works, so I want to hear about that as well. So why don't we start off with, where'd you get the idea?
Yeah, I'd say the Social Justice Sewing Academy came as kind of like a intermingling of my passion for advocacy and activism, mixed with my, former love for just sewing and all things creative and textiles. Specifically, kind of coming at the intersection of 2012 when I was a senior in high school. I was really horrified, angered, upset, all sorts of feelings of frustration with the system, with policy, with humanity when Trayvon Martin got murdered. And so I think in response to that, one thing that I knew I could do was, make a quilt, memorialize it, and not stop talking about it, in honor of, his life, humanity, and obviously in the quest for justice. And so after making that Trayvon quilt, I realized when I was sharing it with lots of other kids, that other kids had things that they were equally as passionate about, whether it was coming from their lived experiences or their environment or, even their school system. So I think, SGSA was created as a space to let, all young people, or not even just young, middle school, high school, undergrads, marginalized people in general. And I wouldn't even say marginalized. I'd change that to like historically oppressed or like underrepresented.
Okay, so you worked on your first quilt, the Trayvon Martin quilt, in 2012. So then how did it go from wanting to memorialize him and what happened to creating this online organization where you're doing good works?
So I say from 2012 to 2016, I'm I'm teaching young people how to sew, definitely ad hoc, like when I can. I'm personally still making a lot of activist quilts when I go home on the weekends. I made one called Say Their Names that features reverse applique technique inspired by Sean Kimber, just kind of learning hand stitches. And so as I'm making quilts that matter to me, I'm realizing that to be able to teach kids how to do it, I need to get funding, I need to get fabric, I need to get space, time constraints. And I think the more I went on through my education at UC Berkeley, the more I realized how much research in my education experiences were informing the work that I was doing. So then I think SGSA came as like a joint creative arts activism mixed with a really heavy education program, a really critical, education program that really kind of teaches kids about, socialization and really pushes their socio-political identity to empower them to, understand that you can get started making change at any age. It's not something you have to wait till you're quote unquote an adult to, to get started with activism.
You mentioned that you've always had a passion for sewing, and I bet a lot of people don't remember this about you, but you published a book with CNT when you were how old?
13.
Called Sew with Sarah. And so I think you have had a passion for sewing for a long time. And you also had a wonderful mentor that you worked with. What's her name?
I had Eleanor, I had Laverne, I had a few like really outstanding quilt mentors that I think, tooled me up. And I think even when I look back on my own experiences, I think a lot of the opportunities I was, afforded were due to my parents being able to, provide that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Having the space to be creative and being supported, whatever that creativity is, sewing, drawing, sports, whatever it is, having that opportunity is really wonderful. So then you mentioned your education. So can you tell me a little bit about your background as far as what you studied at UC Berkeley? And then I know you went on to Harvard.
Yeah, so I did political science and public policy with a minor in African American studies and education, which really I think kind of summarizes, kind of what my passions are. Like I care
Yeah.
about policy, I care about youth, I care about underrepresented voices, I care about obviously the policies that kind of from redlining to gentrification to gerrymandering. Like I really care about, the systems of like what's created those and like understanding systems of oppression, systems of privilege and power, and really the intersectionality of exploring how all identities fit into those systems. And I think obviously minoring in education, coming from a private school background personally, I've been to private school since kindergarten. Going to UC Berkeley was my first, experience at a public school. But I think really going to that private school really, not, I wouldn't say blinded, because I kind of was aware, but I don't think I understood it until I got to be able to spend 90 hours in public schools, getting the hours for my minor. So I think it was like that real hands-on, like, public schools are really underfunded, and like the discrepancies between the quality of education that I was receiving and so many other kids that obviously didn't have the parents or the socioeconomic background to like have access to those Walnut Creek spaces. It was really like, okay, well, let's mitigate the gap, and let's see what other opportunities we can act, like whether it's reading, whether it's readers, whether it's even just textbooks, like all sorts of things kind of matter.
Okay. All right. And then what did you get your master's in?
I got it in prevention science and practice, which was like a joint Harvard Kennedy public policy education degree. And so really that degree was about using a trauma informed lens to work with at-risk marginalized populations, kind of from a psychology standpoint, but really it's more like an intervention framework on like, if we have kids that have these behaviors, what can we do, to not only correct, but really understand. I think it really built a lens of understanding and being able to understand, like, not using a deficit model, but work with kids where they are. What's their strong suit? How can we, use iron to sharpen iron? And like, let's find, regardless of where they're coming from, math might not be their strong suit, but maybe creative writing is. Okay, let's work on that and then build up math skills.
You got your education, and then is that after you finished school when you started the academy, or did you start it before you graduated?
I started it the summer I graduated Berkeley. So I graduated Berkeley in December, and then by like January to like March, I was writing the curriculum out so I could have a 6-week program. Every day I had a lesson plan, an objective, the materials, the steps, the methodology on how we're going to get there. For the first initial SGSA program, I used YPAR methodology, which stands for Youth Participatory Action Research, where kids were doing their own research in their own communities. It was a research-informed art practice. And so kind of using a very methodology based, like, I want kids to be active researchers, active scholars, and then active artivists, which is obviously a hybrid of artists and activists.
I like artivist. That's a good one. I like that. So that first 6-week program, how many kids did you have and how old were they?
37, and they were all in high school. So unique from those 37 kids is that a lot of them were on probation. A lot of them hadn't passed and made it to the next round. So this summer program was like a credit recovery program. We did it in partnership with Upward Bound, which was able to give the academic credit because I submitted my syllabi and like, this is how I'm going to do it. These are the Common Core, objectives we're going to reach. But I think really, it went from a group of kids that were like sewing business for grandmas to like, by the end of the 6 weeks, they were like, oh no, we're artivists and we use fabric. And they just, I think watching their transition and even their initial hesitancy to wanting to use the medium to watching their love for it develop over time was definitely one of the most rewarding parts.
Wow. Now, was there anyone in particular who stood out in that first group that just, sort of helped you really solidify that this was something you wanted to do?
I would say this kid named Juan, and Juan was interviewed for, I think, a podcast or so on Abby Glassenberg's Creative Alliance program. But really, Juan was an active gang member, active in Oakland, had an ankle monitor. He was very much he was a graffiti artist. He'd say, oh, I've tagged this building and I've tagged this. He's very good. And he was just I don't use fabric. My medium is paint. That's my thing. And I was like, well, if you're an artist, you can translate your art into anything. And so I think, he went from oh, I don't want to be in this class to oh, well, I kind of care really about gentrification. Well, why do you care? Because me and my grandma always get pink slips and we get evictions and we get, he's been to 5 different high schools. And really, I think his lived experiences made him excited about wanting to express it through art. Not the fabric inspired him, but really he was I have a story. I want to have my voice heard. And I think his desire for wanting to be heard. And once I said, why don't you make your quilt graffiti style? Let's combine your love for graffiti and just do it in fabric. It was like a spark. And I mean, he would spend his lunch hours. Instead of leaving, he'd stay there and be working on his quilt.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. That's the kind of thing that makes you go, okay, I think I'm onto something here. That's right. So cool.
If Juan can spend his lunch in here, then I think I'm doing something pretty cool.
Yeah.
He was one of the cool kids.
So now, how many, do you have any idea how many different programs you've done so far?
Hundreds. So I say we've definitely worked with over thousands of kids. I think the transition is, it started as a full-time 6-week program, and then I went to Harvard. And so I'm at Harvard, and obviously I'd only have a 6-week full-time program availability in the summer. So I think like I was like, well, I made all these lesson plans for all these days. Why don't I do a workshop where I can work with one group of kids, and instead of them making a full art quilt, we let all these kids make a block. And sewing, we can sew the blocks together and make a community quilt. So
Right.
really the idea for a community quilt was born out of the idea of like I wanted to do programming, but I didn't have 6 weeks of full-time. I didn't have the space, the resources. UC Berkeley really supported the initial program. Harvard was like, well, let's see what you can do. But after a while, like I was able to do a lot of workshops with schools in the Dorchester, in the Boston, in the Cambridge area. And even then, like you could see the discrepancies between, like schools 45 minutes away to consider the Cambridge High School. But, after those workshops, the kids really enjoyed. And like I think for most, it was just the first time using fabric as a medium. So I think kind of bringing that in, the teachers loved it, the students loved it, and then it was able to really just kind of triple like domino effect. Like it just really expanded.
So you've done hundreds of programs. You also talk to quilt guilds, right?
Yes. So when we talk to quilt guilds, I think, yes, we're explaining kind of the overview on what SGSA is and does and how we got here, but really it's a call in, because SGSA is really made possible with all the embroidery volunteers, with all the piecing volunteers, with the long arming volunteers, with monetary donations. SGSA is really the fabric alone. Like everything is made possible because of the quilting community that supports it. So for in an SGSA workshop, I go in, it's maybe an hour and a half of like social justice education. It's a little bit of design time, maybe 30-40 minutes. We share designs. Then they cut and translate their designs into fabric, kind of like a fabric collage. Then I collect all the blocks that are the fabric collages along with the artist statements and kids' names, et cetera, and I mail them to embroidery volunteers who sign up to hand embroider a kid's block. So, for example, if I do a workshop 4 or 5 hours and I get 100 blocks, that's 100 kids who made 100 blocks, and now I need 100 volunteers to embroider those blocks. So kind of the quilt guilds is, sharing, but really kind of like, call for like, would you like to help? Because this is such a community-driven, pretty sustainable, restoratively sustainable model.
So you work with the guilds, and I know you do some education programming with them, and then you're getting all the blocks embroidered, and then you have to figure out a way to get all those quilts made.
Yes, so that is where the Bay Area quilters come in. And so for the most part, I'd say we have a lot of Bay Area quilters or quilt guilds that I'll reach out to, or local fabric store, and be like, hey, can we have a class here? We just, please provide us, a space free of charge. We're going to bring in a bunch of volunteers, and collectively we'll just sew a quilt. So that'll look like maybe 10, 15 people. First we'll square them up, then we'll add borders, then we'll improv piece, then we'll get them together. And I definitely have an amazing team of, Bay Area based volunteers that work on the ground and help with the math, et cetera, et cetera. And we have lunch. It's pretty, again, it's that community model. But then we also have some volunteers, Sarah Bond, we have Jackie Gehring, we have Tara Fawn, a few, even Maria Shell, who've come and volunteered to teach a class where we're making a community quilt in the likeness of their kind of improv style or traditional style. And we have people like Sarah Bond, who just took 20 blocks and she's piecing it all on her own. So definitely, if anyone's, interested in working on a community quilt, it's kind of a big undertaking, but really appreciate it at the end.
You're doing the community quilts, and are those what you call the remembrance quilts?
No. So the Remembrance Quilts is a separate project where we're making full quilts for families who've lost a loved one to either white supremacy or violence or police brutality, or, it's all sorts of, just community violence, like transgender, like all sorts of just people that have just lost loved ones. And so for that, we're reaching out to families who've lost loved ones. We're explaining who we are, what our program is, and then we get clothes or photos from the family that they send to us, and then we pair it with a volunteer who uses the clothes kind of like a memory quilt, for the family who's lost someone.
Okay, so you've got the community quilts, you've got the remembrance quilts, and then I know you're working on another huge project, really focusing on the say their names. So tell me a little bit about that one.
So that one's called the Remembrance Project. And so what that is banners made. And I'd say, honestly, like in my own words, it's kind of like a 2020 version of the AIDS quilt, but far more encompassing of like not one specific, it's not a police brutality. It's really just a violence in general, whether, it's a school shooting, whether it's, domestic abuse violence, whether it's gender violence, like whether it's, all suicide, like all sorts of, it's just violence in general. And I think that project is really memorializing the humanity in people, because I feel like oftentimes, George Floyd, like we knew we knew all the felony assaults that he might have had, or all the, times he might have had, run-ins with the law. But really, what was his favorite color? We know about Trayvon, we know how he was killed, we know George Zimmerman by name, but who was Trayvon? And so really, I think the project is, what were their favorite colors? What did they want to be? What hopes and aspirations did people have, beyond just the moment that their life was snuffed out? But like, who were they up until that moment? So really, it's an art project, yes, but I'd argue even more, it's a heart project, where you get a name, you really have to sit with that name, you have to do research. Some names have been viral, it's easy to find information. Some names you'll only find one article. So you really, as the maker, or the assigned maker, have to go deep and find their GoFundMe and see if you can follow, families' Facebook pages, and really, do the research to find out who that person was. People are more than a statistic, more than an article, more than, just the memory of when they were taken, more than their obituary. It's really about finding out, how can you memorialize someone through fabric, someone you've never met.
How many of those have you gotten so far?
About 300. And
Wow.
I think what's really key is we have a list of thousands of people by name, and we have hundreds of volunteers signing up. And the sad part is our list keeps endlessly growing. Like every day, I mean, in Oakland this weekend, 4 people were murdered. That's 4 more names to add to the list. Like, our name list it's growing in an exponentially, like, absurd rate. And obviously, because it's an American-based project, though, American and Puerto Rico, including U.S. territories. But really, it's like to just be focused, and it's like from 19, I think, like 90, it's kind of where we did the cutoff, to now. So it's like really spanning the last, 3 decades. But yeah, the list just endlessly grows. So I definitely would encourage those makers, who do have the time to, you sign up, you are assigned a name, and you make that name, the best you can.
Yeah. And it's, yeah, I've worked on some of those with you, and it's been really an amazing project when you hold it and you look at pictures, because a lot of them have photos, but then you see their name and they'll include something special about them on the block, and it humanizes it, because I think it's really hard for people to hear, 4 people were murdered in Oakland this weekend. But then when you see their names and you see their face, and just by looking at that block, you learn a little bit about them. It humanizes them, and it makes you more connected to that violence that's taking place in America.
I would 100% agree. I think, like, I've learned so much about so many people. Like, in Chicago this year on Father's Day weekend alone, over 140 people were killed in one weekend in Chicago. And one of the girls, she wanted to be a ballet dancer. She was a straight A student. I mean, she was a 9-year-old, and she was shot at a random bullet through her apartment window, died in her mother's arms. But I mean, like, the things that I learned just from the maker doing all this research, like, her love for ballet alone is like, wow. Like, she becomes more than a 9-year-old, more than a name, but a young, Black girl who was a straight A student, wanted to do ballet, loved animals. Like, there's just so much you learn, through the makers spending time with these names, blocks, and obviously writing these culminating artist statements.
So how do you deal with all the tragedy?
I think, as the hashtag that we've kind of named for the project, I think it's like so for justice. So I think, like, yes, these murders are tragic, but like, what can we do moving forward? Like, to sit and stop in sorrow, or like, we have to move from like our pain or our anger or our sorrow to action. And whether it's sewing for it, whether it's reposting, whether it's calling senators, whether it's, voting, whether it's moving our dollars, I think everything really can lead down to, so what tangible actions can I do to work on this issue? And so I think sometimes, people might not be thinking about it, especially if it's not impacting your community. If I live in Los Gatos, where there's not much, gun violence, compared to East Palo Alto, I might not be concerned with it because it's not directly impacting me. But I think as you see these names and these projects, and you read all these dates and really sit with the artist statements, I think that, it affects everyone, whether it's you directly or not. Indirectly, as MLK says, a threat to justice, a threat to anyone's justice, you should feel like is a threat to yours as well.
I think that's really well said. Is there anything that you can think of that I forgot to ask you, or that you really wish you could tell me about?
I would say, I would just really want to say, like, I think SGSA has, like, for example, it's been a magnet and often a creative art form that has a really serious subculture of white supremacy. Like the sewing world is reflective of America. In the last 4 years, we've seen how racist it is. But I would really just, I mean, the SHSA community, between making quilts, between long arming, between making banners, I think the SHSA is definitely calling in some amazing creative people in the sewing world. And I think more than anything, I'm seeing, people become far more outspoken and intentionally anti-racist. So I think, I can really just say, for example, people that I've never seen say anything in the last 8 months, particularly since COVID hit, and this racial awakening that America has kind of come through. I like this coming of age moment for America to realize racism is real. Why don't we all care? Let's not make it a black issue. Let's make it an everyone issue. I really would just I'm definitely I'm seeing the slight waves of whether it's Janome making statements, Spoonflower donating. Companies are really saying something, and allyship is becoming more than just saying it. But I can see the actions that are following through, and particularly with the Quilts of Remembrance Project, to have so many quilters willing to make a full quilt for someone who they don't know. We know that quilting is time, resources, talent, energy. Quilting is an affluent, expensive, kind of privileged hobby, some might even be able to argue, or not even hobby, art form, in general, all forms. But I'd really just say it's been pretty amazing to see how well the community has supported not only all these projects, but their continued support of youth voice, youth art, youth embroidery, in addition to full quilts and banners and everything else in between.
It is pretty amazing. And I know for myself, as it became more tense in the middle of the year after George Floyd was killed, realizing as an organization that we all have to stand up and do our part and be willing to take a stand for what we think is important. And I know for me and for CNT, social justice and getting to work with you and work on these projects and learn more about it, it's been really eye-opening. And sometimes it's really hard, and you do have to, become more aware of just how you see things versus how other people see them. And I've really enjoyed it. It's been really eye-opening and educational. And, there are stories that you tell me and I'm like, what? And I know as we work together, I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate that. And it's really been a lot of fun. And I look forward to doing more projects with you.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you for the time. And I look forward to hopefully having other people join in.